What can we understand about what Jesus experienced from outside of himself that would cause him to feel sad unto death?
我们对于那让耶稣极其伤痛的原因，应该如何去理解呢？
What would cause him to cry out with tears?
是什么让耶稣祷告的时候汗珠
To
如大
throw
雪地一样，
himself on the ground?
让他跪在地上祷告？
To bounce back and forth between his disciples, to wake them up and warn them, and to go back to his Father and pray, and back and forth and back and forth.
耶稣他祷告，然后又去提醒门徒们，然后又去祷告，然后又去提醒门徒们。
Well, this is where, when we study the scriptures,
当我们学习圣经的时候，
we always need to make sure that we only say what the scriptures say. We don't go any further.
就是我们将对圣经的理解限制在圣经所告诉我们的信息里。
So when Jesus says the cup,
就是当耶稣说杯的时候，
we don't say, oh, well, he meant the cup of wrath.
我们不应该理解为他在说上帝愤怒的杯。
Right? Always filling in the details with our own philosophical system makes us feel very comfortable.
当我们用符合自己哲学的方式思考的时候，会让我们感觉很舒服。
But it causes us to really miss out on very important aspects of God's character.
但有的时候会让我们理解错神的某些属性。
And so fortunately, it turns out we can solve this mystery, this puzzle,
但是幸运的是，我们可以解决这段经文带来的困难，
simply by focusing on what the scripture does tell us.
只是通过关注圣经所告诉我们的信息就可以。
It doesn't tell us which cup this is.
圣经没有告诉我们这杯是什么，
Right? It leaves out several details.
只留下了很少的线索。
But in the Gospel of Luke,
但是在路加福音
in chapter 22,
22章，
if we keep on reading,
如果我们一直读下去的话，
we find Jesus saying something that he's never said before.
我们会发现耶稣说了一些他从来没有说过的内容。
It happens after this time of prayer,
就发生在克西马尼园的祷告之后。
but it helps us understand what it is that he has entered into, what's changed.
但可以帮助我们了解发生了什么事情。
So he goes over the disciples and
他去告诉门徒，
he says, let's go towards them,
就是让他们跟着
because
来
now
的人走，
Judas and all of these people are coming towards them.
因为犹大他带了一群人过来。
And Jesus says this,
耶稣说，
now
现在
is the hour of the power of darkness.
他说现在是你们的时候，黑暗掌权了。
Now is the hour of the power of darkness.
现在是你们的时候，黑暗掌权了。
And that's important because one of the interesting things that Jesus does when he's talking is he goes back and forth. He uses both the word, the cup, and the hour as he's praying. He uses those two words to refer to the same thing.
在这一段的经文之中呢，耶稣他不断的使用杯和时候这两个词。
And it's one of the ways we know he's not simply looking at a cup of wrath is because he talks about the cup, but he also says the hour.
所以在耶稣同时说到杯和时候的时候，他所说的就不只是单纯的愤怒之杯。
So we need to think in our own scriptural memories here, what do we know about the hour of the power of darkness?
所以我们要去理解什么叫做黑暗掌权了。
Well, what we know is that Jesus told us it was coming.
首先，耶稣说他会临到的。
What he told us is he said, work while it is yet light.
耶稣
Work while it's still daylight. Do the work of the Lord while it's still daytime.
耶稣曾经说，趁着白日，我们必须做那差我来者的工，
Because the hour is coming when no man can work.
而黑暗将到，就没有人能做工了。
그런 시간이 올 거기 때문에 아직 낮이라는 거예요.
And interestingly, that hour has now come.
而这个黑暗的时刻现在就降临了。
So Jesus said it was going to happen, and it did happen.
所以耶稣曾说它将要发生，而它也确实发生了。
온 거예요.
He's also been praying for it. One of the things you'll note in these different accounts of the Garden of Gethsemane is as Jesus prays, he's praying parts of the Lord's prayer.
耶稣在克西马尼园的祷告里也使用了部分主祷文的内容。
기도를 하시는데 그게 주기도문을 하시고 계세요.
He prays, for example, he says to the disciples, pray that you not be led into temptation.
耶稣对门徒们说：“你们要警醒，免得入了迷惑。
Does that sound familiar? ”
听起来很熟悉。
It's exactly the same word. It's
这里的
wording
用词
that's
和
used
主祷
from the
文的
Lord's
用词
Prayer.
是一样的。
주기도문하고
And so Jesus is using those same words as he says.
耶稣使用了相同的词。
주기도문에 말씀하신 것을 계속해서 반복하고 계세요.
So when he prays and he says, Father,
他祷告的时候，
아버지 이렇게
他说：“
기도하세요.
父
and
啊
he says, pray, tells the disciples, pray that you don't enter into temptation.
当他对门徒说话，告诉他们免得进入试探。
기도하라 얘기하고 있어요.
He's simply praying the way he always has,
他就是在使用他所祷告的内容，
which is a sign that this is the same Jesus that we've known all along. He hasn't suddenly lost his nerve or he didn't estimate wrongly.
그 예수님이
这也告诉我们，这段经文里的耶稣与之前的没有区别，他没有如陷入一种不同的状态里一样，说不同的话，
아이고 잘못 생각했네.
而是一样的。
실수네 뭐 이런 상황이 아니라는 거예요.
But let me tell you what has changed for Jesus.
不过有一件事情确实改变了，
Listen carefully.
잘
请听
들어보세요.
好，
It's not Jesus who changed.
耶稣他并没有变化，
Right? Jesus is the same as we've always known him.
他是始终如一的。
알고 있는 예수님으로 그대로 유지하고
Now,
있고요.
Pastor Tim will be so happy to hear this. I'm going to need Pastor Tim's help to come up here. Now he loves when we do
现
this.
在
He
我
loves
需要
this.
请提摩太牧师上来帮忙。
Do you remember the last time Pastor Tim was up here with us? Do you remember when that was?
上次请他帮忙是什么时候来着？
올라왔을 때 기억하세요?
It was at the start of Lent. Do you remember?
是在苦难周刚开始的时候。
사순절 처음이었는데요.
And it was the time of Jesus' baptism.
上次是在讲耶稣的洗礼，
And Pastor Tim was playing himself. He was playing the hopeless sinner.
提摩太牧师扮演的是没有盼望的罪人，
역할을 하셨는데요.
Dr. Foley was playing God the Father.
弗利牧博士所演的是天父，
And I was playing Jesus.
而我扮演的是耶稣。
목사님은 예수님이었어요.
And in the time of the baptism
当耶稣
of
受洗的
Jesus,
时候，
세례를 받을 때 예수님 세례를 받을 때
we talked about how Jesus, who had been over here,
就意味着耶稣是从这里
여기 하나님 아버지와 함께 있었는데
comes over here. Do you remember that?
来
And
到
he
了罪人中间。
identifies completely with fallen, sinful man.
耶稣他从天父那里来，去到了罪人当中。
빠진 그런 사람 옆에서 예수님이 있었다는 거예요. 세례 받을 때.
And from that point on, that never changes for Jesus.
而从那时候起，
Ever.
耶稣从来没有改变过。
아버지 옆에 있었던 게 아니라 죄에 빠진 인간치게
That
있었던 거예요.
there's never even a moment where he wonders whether it's the right thing to do.
他也没有任何时刻在犹豫要做什么事情。
죄에 빠진 인간하고 함께 있는 것이 이게 맞는 건가라고 생각해 본 적도 없어요.
So the idea that Jesus would go, well, I like Pastor Tim, but I really want to go back to Galilee and have that picnic, and that's really what I want. I don't want to die, is ridiculous.
但是认为耶稣想要回到加利利，不想面对钉十字架这样的想法是很荒谬的。
겟세마네 동산에 가서 내가 죽어야 될 그런 거를 보니까 싫다 이런 게 아니라는 거예요.
He's the good shepherd.
耶稣是好牧人，
자시거든요, 예수님.
Even at the point where he is in the hardest prayer he's ever faced.
即使他面对着最为艰难的时刻，
기도를 하는 상황에서도 직면에서도 정말 하나님 예수님은 똑같았어요.
He's focused on them.
耶稣让人将注意力放在了自己的门徒身
초점을
上。
맞췄단 말이에요.
Right? So he keeps going back to them.
그래서
耶稣一次又一次的去到门徒那里，
And truly, here we get a picture of how he is our friend, our mediator. He intercedes for
这
us.
展示了耶稣作为我们的朋友、中保和代祷者的身份。
우리랑 함께 하신 분인 거예요.
I mean, the disciples are out.
当使徒们都睡着了，
그냥 잠에 빠졌잖아요.
So the only person who's praying for them is him.
唯一为他们祷告的人是耶稣。
기도하시는 분은 예수님 한 분밖에 수밖에 없는 거예요.
So he, even in that moment, never would think of just leaving it all behind to focus on the fact that he didn't want to die.
即便是在那一刻，他也没有不管不顾其他的人。
오는 순간에서도 하나님 예수님께서는 우리와 함께 하신 거예요.
But Pastor Tim did such a good job playing a hopeless sinner that we brought him up for a different role today.
不过今天要给提摩太牧师的角色不太一样。
희망 없는 그런 인간의 역할을 하는 것이 아니라 오늘은
So today, Pastor Tim, you're going to play the devil.
今天提摩太牧师要扮演的是
Right? So last
魔
time
鬼，
you were a sinner, but you've been promoted or demoted.
而
Maybe
我
I
要
don't
给各位一
know.
幅会令你们惊掉下巴的画面。
And so I want to show you a picture that will blow your mind.
여러분들에게 이제 완전히 이해할 수 있는 그런 장면을 제가 설명해 드릴게요.
You remember that after Jesus was baptized,
在耶稣受洗之後，
받은 다음에요.
remember what happens?
发生了什么事情？
What happens? What's the very first thing that happens?
第一件事是什么？
일어난 일은
Taken out to the wilderness. Holy
圣灵
Spirit
带
takes
领
him
耶
out
稣
to the
进入到
wilderness,
旷野
그
里，
다음에 광야로 이끌려 가셨죠.
and he faces Satan.
面对了撒旦，
만났어요.
And so Satan tempts Jesus 3 times.
而撒旦也3次试探了耶
3
稣，
times.
세 번이에요.
3次。
3 times. And each time, Jesus responds like this. I'm still Jesus, and Dr. Foley is still the Father here.
그래서
就是弗利博士还是会扮演天父的角
And
色。
so
유혹받을 때마다
Satan says, hey, turn these stones to bread. And Jesus says, hey, look, man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God.
撒旦说就把石头变成面包，而耶稣则是用经文回应了撒旦。
그 우리가 빵으로만 살 것이 아니라 하나님 입에서 나오는 그 말씀으로 산다 이렇게 얘기했어요.
All right? Satan says,
撒旦说
why don't you jump down from the temple? Because then,
从圣殿上跳下去，
then your Father will save you.
天父会拯救你。
아버지가 구해 주실 거예요.
And Jesus says, I'm not going to put my Father to the test.
然后耶稣回应说：“不可试探你的神。”
시험에 두지 않을 거라고 얘기했어요.
And then Satan says, how about I give you everything?
然后撒旦说：“我把
I'll
一切
give
都
you
给你，
everything.
내가 모든 걸 다 주겠다. 사탄이 또 유혹했어요.
You just worship me.
只要你敬拜
나를
我。
경배해라.
And Jesus says, I'm only going to worship my.
나는 오직 하나님 아버지.
而耶稣说：“我只敬拜我的天父。”
So Jesus' whole ministry is based upon that opposition of Satan.
对，耶稣整个的服饰都是在对抗撒旦的这3个试探。
사탄에 대해서 반대하는 사탄에 대항하는 그런 사역이에요.
He is always opposing the work of Satan.
他总是在反对撒旦的工作，
그 일한 것들을 항상 반대해요.
He is always binding Satan, setting people free.
他捆绑撒旦，给人以自由。
묶고 사람들을 거기서 이게 자유롭게 하세요.
Healing people.
他治愈百姓，
사람들을 치유하시고요.
He's forgiving people.
他赦免百姓的罪，
And he's preaching, he's proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord,
그리고
the kingdom of God.
他的
the
讲
kingdom
道
of
也
God.
是在讲述神的国降临。
And so in that whole point of the Gospels, up to the point he enters the garden,
그
所以从整个福音书一直到克西马尼园的祷告，
그런 모든 사역은요.
Jesus is the doer.
耶稣都是那行动者，
행하시는 분이에요.
He's always the one who's carrying out the will of God. That's his purpose. That's what he
他一
does.
直在遵行上帝的旨意。
실천하시는 행하시는 분이에요.
He says, I only do what I see my Father doing.
耶稣说：“我只做上帝要我做的事情。
하라고 하는 것만 내가 한다. 그분처럼 한다 이렇게 얘기했어요.
And then he goes into the garden.
그리고서
然后他就来到了克西马尼园，
And look,
잘 보세요.
this is what happens.
这就是所发生的事情。
This
이런 일이
这
일어나는
个
거예요.
blew his mind.
让他感到非常的震惊。
아주 놀라신 거예요.
His whole ministry is focused on rejecting Satan's work and his plan and his purpose.
耶稣整个的施工都是在反对撒旦的工作，对抗撒旦的目的。
그 사탄을 반대하는 거였었어요.
He says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good tidings to the poor. He's
他说：“
always
主的灵
doing.
在我身上，叫我传福音给贫穷的人，等等等等。”
But at Gethsemane,
但是在克西马尼园里，
동산에서는
his Father's will is hidden
하나님의
但是天
뜻이
天父的旨意
숨겨진
是
거예요.
within the plan of the enemy.
그
天父的旨意与仇敌的计划是一致的。
숨겨졌기 때문에 놀라신 거예요. 힘드셨어요.
So Jesus, who had always been over here with his Father, is suddenly
所以始终与天父在一起的
not
耶
only
稣，
alone,
突然变得独自一人了，
but he's presented with something that goes beyond our comprehension.
而且是一种超越我们理解的这种
당신이 이해할
도ഷൻ
수
이름.
없는 것 그 이상의 상황이 펼쳐진 거예요.
The will of his Father
和天父的旨意
뜻이요.
is now not able to be distinguished. It's not able to be separated from the will of Satan himself.
与撒旦的计划重合了。
뜻하고 같이 분리되지 않았기 때문에 놀라신 거예요.
And it turns out that any time that we read about the cup in the Bible,
因为当我们在圣经里每次看到杯这个
you
词，
see the same principle, the same thing happen.
我们就会看到相同的原则在这里出现。
So when Jeremiah and Isaiah
当耶利米和以赛亚
제레마야,
and Isaiah
이사야를 보면요.
talk about Jerusalem drinking the cup,
当他们谈论耶路撒冷喝那杯的时候，
이렇게 얘기하거든요.
what's happened?
发生了什么事情呢？
Jerusalem has been absolutely destroyed, laid to waste by its enemies.
耶路撒冷被敌人完全的摧毁了。
원수에 의해서 완전히 무너진 거거든요.
So, in fact, to be completely accurate, I have to have Pastor Tim take a little bit of a step forward, and Dr. Foley standing behind Pastor Tim.
제가
两个人的位置需要
여기
改变一下。
앞에
So you got
있고요.
to go behind him there. The will of God is hidden
神的旨意被隐藏了。
숨겨진 거예요.
so that when I try to see and understand
当我试
what
图理解的时候，
이해를 하려고 그러는데
because I only do what I see my Father doing.
因为我知道耶稣完全是按照天父的旨意行事的。
하는 거를 보고 하시거든요.
Now my Father is no longer over here by me where I thought he was going to be.
但此刻他就看不到天父的旨意了。
His will is hidden inside our enemy.
因为天父的旨意隐藏在了撒旦的计划里，
뒤에 숨겨져 있는 거예요.
And the Father is essentially saying to Jesus,
天父最终对耶稣说
이렇게 말씀하시는 거예요.
I have placed you under his power. I the Father, have placed you, Jesus, under his power.
是天父将耶稣放在了撒旦的权柄之下。
근데 뭐라고 했냐면은 내가 너를 사탄 밑에 둘 것이다 이렇게 한 거예요.
This is very much the temptations that Jesus was victorious over, right? These were the three temptations. He turned away Satan's plan. In every case, he said, no, no, no. Right, Father? And the Father said, right.
그래서 예수님이
耶稣之前胜过了耶稣的撒旦的三个试探，每一次都胜过了。
하나님 아버지와 함께했고 하나님 아버지의 뜻으로 그걸 모든 거를 이겼거든요.
But now when Jesus enters the Garden of Gethsemane,
但是这次耶稣在克西马尼园里，
the cup appears.
杯出现了。
The cup that when Jesus says to James and John,
耶稣曾对
when Jesus talks to
雅
James
各
and
和约
John
翰
about
提到
that
过这
cup,
一点。
그 잔에 대해서 이 제자들한테 베드로, 요한, 야고보 얘기했어요.
he said, can you drink this cup?
耶稣问：“我的杯你能喝吗
마실 수 있느냐?
And they said, yes.
他们说可以。
제자들이 네 그랬어요.
And he said, you will.
耶稣回答说：“你们会的。
마실 거야, 이 잔을 마실 거야 그랬어요.
Interestingly, this is why when you read in the very early church history back for the first several hundred years where Christians were regularly being martyred,
很有趣的是，如果你观察主后的几百年，很多基督徒他们都殉道了。
수백 년 동안 그 순교자들을 보면요.
martyrdom is called the cup.
殉道就有一个称，还有一个称呼叫做杯。
잔이에요, 잔.
The cup happens when the will of God is completely hidden within the plan and power of our enemies.
杯的出现时，就是神的旨意隐藏在仇敌的计划中。
권세 안에 하나님의 뜻이 숨겨져 있는 거예요.
You see, not because we've sinned,
不是因为我们犯了罪，
그래서가 아니라
but because we're doing the will of God. We're doing what he wants us to
而是我
do.
们在遵行他的旨意。
그래서 그렇게 되는 거예요.
But we get confused, we get lost because
但我们有时候会糊涂。
혼동을 한단 말이에요.
the one thing that we human beings simply can't understand is the good guys the bad guys winning
因为我
and
们
the good
很难
guys
理解
being
坏人
completely
当道，好
destroyed.
人遭殃的结局。
한 사람이 그 이기고 아주 좋은 사람이 완전히 무너지는 것에 대해서 우리가 이해가 안 가기 때문에 여기서 혼동을 하는 거예요.
And yet, that's exactly what the Father directs the Son to experience in the Garden of Gethsemane.
而这恰好就是天父让耶稣在克西马尼园里所经历的。
예수님께 이렇게 그런 일이 일어나는 것이 이제 이것 때문에 일어난 거예요.
From that point on,
从那时起，
we don't hear the Father's voice,
我们就再也没有听到过天父的声音了。
right? That voice that we heard when he was baptized saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well
就像
pleased."
耶稣受洗的时候那样的情景就再也没有过了。
잊지 못해요.
Instead, and in fact, Jesus isn't now the actor. He's not the one who's doing the action on the stage.
耶稣在此时就不再是那个在舞台上进
He
行
is
演
not.
出的
When he
人了。
comes out of the garden,
아버지의 그 뜻을 이루는 사람, 그러니까는 이렇게 행동하는 사람이 아닌 거예요.
right? Before he went in the garden, he was the one who was doing everything. Even in the Lord's Supper, he's breaking the bread. He's
但
saying,
之
"This is
前
the
他
cup
一
of
直
the
是
new
那个舞
covenant."
台上的主角。
이렇게 행동으로 하시는 분이었어요.
But in Gethsemane,
在克西马尼园里，
에서는
his father remained silent,
天父保持了沉默，
하나님 아버지가 침묵하세요.
and his will
而天父的旨意
아버지의 뜻이
is absolutely impossible. It's unseeable. It can't be seen because it's hidden within
天父的旨意变成了不可见的东西，因为它
within
隐藏了。
Satan's plan.
그 사탄의 계획 때문에 그 서 있는 거예요.
That I really want you to think about this Holy Week.
我希望各位能够思考这个问题，在这个圣诞周里面，
그렇게 생각을 좀 해봤으면 좋겠어요.
Because
因为
Jerusalem experienced it,
因为耶路撒冷经历过这个事情，
Jesus experienced
耶
it,
稣经历过这个，
James and John experienced it,
雅各和约翰经历过这个，
경험했고요.
the martyrs experienced it,
殉道者们经历过这个，
and so will you.
所以你也会经历这一点。
당신들, 여러분들도 할 거예요.
You see, we like to believe that God's work is done by God's people only.
我们希望神的旨意是由神的子民来成就，
사람들로 인해서 다 모든 것이 이루어지고 끝나기를 원해요.
That God's work is always done by the good guys.
그래서
希望神的旨意由好人去完成。
이루어지기를 원해요.
So as long as we know who the good guys are,
所以我们如果知道谁是那个好人的话，
then we know what God is
那
doing.
么我们就知道神在做什么了。
나 하나님이 하셨구나 생각해요.
But do you know
但你知道吗？
how much work of God is done by the bad guys?
知道神有多少旨意是由恶人们达成的吗？
일들이 하나님의 뜻이 나쁜 사람에 의해서 이루어지는지 아세요?
Not because they're trying to,
不是因为恶人想这样做，
사람들이 막 노력을 해서 된 게 아닌 거예요.
not because God is working through all different religions because everybody goes to heaven. Not that.
也不是每个宗教都通往天国，
모든
不是这样
다른
的。
사람, 종교 가진 사람들을 뭐 천국에 가게 하려고 한 게 아니에요.
It is because it is impossible to oppose God's purposes
因为神的旨意是無法被拒绝的。
목적을 반대하는 거는 불가능한 거예요.
And so, over and over again in Scripture, one of the most common themes that we see
그래서
所以在圣经里，我们所见的最常见的东西，
네, 우리가 보는 것은
is God's enemies accomplishing God's purpose
就是神的仇敌达成了神的旨意，
뜻을 이룬단 말이에요.
and
그리고
destroying themselves in the process.
并在这个过程中自我毁
그
灭。
사탄 하나님의 원수들이 자신들이 무너져 버리는 거예요.
While God's people are redeemed.
神的百姓则受到了拯救。
동시에 하나님의 사람들은 구원을 받는 거예요.
And so, Jesus, you can sit down now, Pastor Tim. Thank you. You're a very good Satan. Very good job being Satan. So, Jesus had been predicting his death and resurrection. That he knew.
耶稣已经预言过他的死和复活，这是他所知道的。
부활된다는 걸 아셨어요.
But it took the church even centuries to fully be able to even come to a little bit of an understanding of the depth of what God the Father did in terms of his plan on the cross.
但是教会花了几个世纪才了解了一点点，就是天父上帝在定十字架这件事情上面所做的这个所扮演的角色。
One of the problems with the idea of just saying, "Oh, it's the cup, it's a cup, it's a cup," is that that's too small a way of describing what God did.
就是将注意力放在这个杯上，只能解释天父所做的工作的一小部分。
더 작게 이렇게 축소해서 얘기하세요.
And in this case, it is not the full story of His redeeming us.
但是这并非是救赎故事的全貌。
이렇게 구해주시는 그런 전체 이야기가 안 들어가 있단 말이에요.
What Jesus is horrified by
耶稣对这件事情恐惧至极，
공포스러우셨어요.
is that God's plan and Satan's plan are now.
因为神的旨意和撒旦的计划在那个时候变成一样的了。
사탄의 그 계획과 같이 서 있었단 말이에요.
This is what Jesus calls the hour of the power of darkness where no man can work.
这就是耶稣所说的黑暗掌权了， 黑暗来临之后就没有人能够做工了。
어떤 사람도 일을 하지 못한다라고 설명한 그 시간이에요.
And so for the rest of the New Testament, when Paul writes and Peter writes and John writes, they keep coming back to these themes.
在新约后面的书卷，无论是保罗、彼得还是雅各，他们都不断的回到这个主题之中，
That say things like that God destroyed death by death.
就是上帝用死亡来战胜死亡。
God used death to destroy death.
죽음을 사용해서 죽음을 이기신다는 거예요.
That Jesus became sin, even though he didn't know sin, he became sin.
耶稣被定罪，虽然他并没有犯罪。
죄가 되셨어요.
So these are the kind of ways that the New Testament begins to try to describe the fullness of what happens here.
而这是新约不断在解释的主题。
그 성경에서 전체를 얘기하려고 노력하고 있는 거 신약에 보면.
But for you,
但是对于各位，
the good news is this.
好消息是这
좋은
个：
소식은 이거예요.
Your redemption didn't come from a superhero.
你的救恩不是来自于一个超级英雄。
초능력자에게 온 것이 아니에요.
Listen,
잘
请听
들으세요.
好，
from the moment that Jesus exits Gethsemane,
自耶稣在克西马尼园的祷告之后，
동산에 갈 때 그 순간까지는
all the power is in the hands of Satan.
权柄都放在了撒旦的手中。
모든 권세는 사탄이 갖고 있었어요.
Satan accomplishes everything.
撒旦可以做成任何的事情。
그 모든 뜻을 다 이뤘어요.
God hands the keys to Satan and says, "Here, these are yours. You run the universe."
撒旦把钥匙给了撒旦，
마음대로 해 이렇게 한 거예요.
And Satan does.
而撒旦也没有客气。
And this is the good news for you.
而这也是我们的好消息，
No weapon formed against you can prosper.
就是没有对付你我的武器可以长
도
存。
여러분들이 번영하는데 쓰여지지 못할 거예요.
All things work together for your good.
万物都相互效力，为了你的益处。
좋은 선한 목적에 사용될 거예요.
The promise that the Bible gives is not that there will always be more good guys than bad guys, so that eventually we'll win in the end.
圣经的应许不是说好人总是多过坏人，所以最后都是好人得胜。
아주 막 성공적으로 좋은 사람이 된다 이거가 아니에요.
It's that all people,
이
소요의
모든
를.
사람을 얘기해요.
including Satan himself,
包括撒旦他自己，
빠지도 모든 사람.
cannot withstand the will of God, but yet fulfill it even as they try to stop it.
都只能达成神的旨意，即使他们尽全力要阻止。
뜻에 쓰지 못한다는 거예요.
And so Jesus, so the good news is
好消息是，
소식은요.
that even Satan himself
即使是撒旦他自己，
fulfills, he accomplishes God's purpose,
都是在完成神的旨意。
even while he's trying to do his own plan to destroy God's
即使他
purpose.
自己计划着要毁掉神的计划，
눈을 털려고 아무리 그래도 결국에는 하나님의 뜻을 이룬다.
And that's true for
我
you.
们也是如此。
그것이 여러분들에게 진리라는 거예요.
As you face that cup, which you will,
当你也面对着杯的时候，事实上你也一定会
이렇게 맞닥뜨리면
James did,
像雅各一样，
야고보서가
John
像
did,
约翰一样，
요한이 그랬고
these martyrs did,
像那些殉道者
여기
一样
있는 ， 순교자들이 그랬고요.
and you will too.
你也一样。
그렇게 하려는 거예요.
You will find times in your life that it seems like that the work of God is completely absent and that evil has overcome.
你会发现人生中神的旨意似乎消失了，而邪恶正在夺取胜利。
뭐 악한 사탄이 하나님이 여러분들을 막 무너뜨리고 할 때가 올 거예요.
And that you won't be able to see God's will because the only thing you'll be able to see is the will of the enemy and the power of the enemy.
你无法看到神的旨意，而只能看到仇敌的计划以及他们的能力。
어둠의 권세만 보이고 사탄이 움직이는 거 나쁜 것만 보인단 말이에요.
And Hebrews describes Jesus, remember, he says he is the author and the perfecter of our faith. He is the one who creates our faith. Jesus is the originator of our
说耶
faith.
稣是我们信心的创造者和完成者。
믿음을 이렇게 주시고요.
And so what Jesus calls us to do in those moments
耶稣在那些时刻让我们所做的，
순간에서 예수님이 우리를 부르세요.
is to do exactly what he did.
就是他所做的事
그분이
情。
하신 거랑 똑같이 우리에게도 하세요.
He said, I can't see it. I can't see your will. I can't.
볼수
耶稣
없고
曾经看不到神的旨
If,
意。
if this cup can't disappear unless I drink it, then I will.
如果这杯不能被拿去，那么耶稣会喝这
내가
杯。
마시지 않고서는 없어지지 않는 거예요.
Your will be done.
耶稣说：“愿你的旨意成
여러분들이
就。
하나님의 뜻대로 하시옵소서라는 그 자세가 필요한 거예요.
Not because I understand it,
这不是因为耶稣他理解，
not because I like
也
it,
不是因为耶稣他喜欢，
not even because it seems good to
甚至也
me,
不是因为这旨意看起来很
여러분들이
好，
좋은 것 같지도 않아도
but because it's you
只是因为这是天父的旨意，
주셨기 때문에
and I trust you.
而耶稣他信靠天父。
That's the ultimate conclusion for Lent. It's this thing we said last week. Faith is not a little thing.
这就是大斋节的一个目的所在。像我们上次所说的，信心不是一件小事，
그 small
It's not a little thing.
이 작은 게 아니에요.
It's not one part of many things in the Christian life.
信心不是基督教信仰诸多事情中的一个，
가지가 아닌 거예요.
It's the whole thing.
而是基督教信仰的一切。
받는 것이 믿음이라는 거예요.
And God has shown you. He will take you through that cup.
而
You will face
是
them.
而是已经显明了，他将会带领你们去
그
喝那杯。
시간을 통과할 거라고 그랬단 말이에요.
He won't give you the gift of understanding it.
他甚至不会去给你理解这一切的就
You
是
may
恩
be
典，
horrified about it,
你可能会因此而感到很恐惧，
막 무서워질 거예요.
but His will be accomplished.
但是神的旨意将会被成就。
And He gives you the gift of trusting Him.
그리고
他给你的礼物就是信靠他，
이 신뢰할 수 있는 그 신뢰, 믿음을 주시는 거예요.
And so that's why He gives us this cup.
所以他给了你这个杯。
하나님께서 우리에게 이 잔을 주셨어요.
It's not that the other cup was disappeared because, as we saw, James and John drank from it.
这并不是说雅各和约翰所喝的那苦难之杯不见了，
It's because this cup is what gives us the strength
而是这个杯将会给我们力量，
강해질 수 있어요.
to be weak.
그
成为那软弱的
강해질 수
人，
있는데 어떻게 약해질 수 있는 강함을 얻는 거예요.
To no longer be the active person in our life,
不再成为一个信仰的演员，
but to not be able to do anything, to be the passive person, just like Jesus was.
而是成为一个像耶稣一样的人。
하신 것처럼 우리는 그냥 수동적인 사람이 되는 거예요.
So now we come to this table.
现在我们来到这圣餐的桌前，
식탁에 모일 거예요.
Jesus renews his promise to us,
耶稣更新了神的应许，
그 약속을 하셨어요.
and we can trust him
我们可以信靠他，
우리가 믿어야 돼요.
just as he can trust his Father,
就像他信靠他的天父一样。
하나님 아버지를 신뢰한 것처럼 우리가 해야 돼요.
even when he looked and he couldn't see his Father, all he could see was Satan.
即使他望眼看去，看不到天父，而只能看到撒旦，
사탄만 보여도 신뢰를 했잖아요.
He said, I'll still trust that plan.
他仍然相信天父。
계획을 그냥 잡으면 되는 거예요.
You come now.
我们来到这里，
함께 하면 좋겠어요.
No matter what the plan is that the Lord is working in your
无
life,
论神在我们人生中的计划是什么，
어떤 계획을 세우든지
no matter you've been turned over to your enemies,
无论我们是不是被交到仇敌
no
的手
matter
中，
that there's no good guys to be seen,
无论是不是有好人可以让我们看到，
돌아봐도 좋은 사람이 보이지 않아요.
no matter that the bad guys won,
无论仇敌想要的是什么，
죽어도
his will
他的旨意
is
하나님의 뜻은
being done.
是一定会被成就的。